Hello, my name is Matthew Baldwin of Mars Hill University, and I recorded this video on April 1st, 2020 during the COVID-19 quarantine crisis as a learning aid for the students in my Religion 201 class, The Bible as Literature. It's week 12 of our course, and our topic is the fourth narrative complex that we're looking at in the Bible, and that narrative complex is the story of the prophet Jeremiah, mainly as we find it in the book of Jeremiah. But in order to make sense of Jeremiah's oracles and the narratives about Jeremiah, you have to try to understand him in his historical context. Now, according to Jeremiah chapter 1, verses 1 through 3, Jeremiah began his work in the reign of King Josiah of Judah. And Josiah, who is the last independent king of Judah, is the grandson of a character named Manasseh. Manasseh is the subject of this video. So I've prepared a few slides and images, and hopefully I'll be able to show them to you without any problems. I'm using Screencast-O-Matic, and this is only the second time I've ever done so. Right now I'm going to try to switch my view so that I'm off in the corner here, and you can see my screen. Right here, what I've got displayed is 2 Kings. And 2 Kings 21, verses 1 through 18 are the story of Manasseh. But that's not where we're going to begin. Where we're going to begin is with a glimpse back into the history of Israel and Judah in the 7th century BCE. As you may recall, because I've mentioned it so many times in class, the dominant power in the 7th century BCE was the Assyrian Empire, with its capital and its most important cities in the Tigris River Valley in the northern part of Mesopotamia, the cities of Nineveh, Calah, and Ashur being some of the most significant cities of the Assyrian Empire. By the year 684 BCE, at which time Manasseh was just a boy and was king, or perhaps he was already in his early 20s. Scholars are unclear on exactly when Manasseh, son of Hezekiah, took power. Some put him in taking power only after Hezekiah's death. Hezekiah, we know, died around 686 or so. And some put him in power as a co-regent with Hezekiah 10 years earlier, 597, 596. I mean, 697, 696. So there's a little bit of obscurity around the origins of Manasseh's reign, but we know he was 12 years old when he began to reign. And he reigned during a period of incredible stability. In fact, he was able to maintain his rule in Judah for a period of 50 years from, as you can see on this map, or on this timeline, from 687 to 543. Well, that's only, of course, 44 years, but it's believed that, as I said, that he came to power about 10 years before, and according to the 2 Kings, he reigned for 55 years in Judah. So it is important to sort of give the fudginess to the numbers and not make too much of a deal about it. Anyway, looking back at this map, right here, you can see, I'm probably obscured here. Here, I'll bring myself to the front. So you can see when you look at this map that the Assyrian Empire extended all the way down into Egypt during this time. And the way that they dealt with subject populations is similar to the way that they dealt with the people of Israel. Under Sargon II, in the year Sargon II, you see mentioned here on this slide. In the year 722 BC, Sargon came up against Samaria, besieged it, destroyed it, and then took the Israelite peoples into captivity in the central parts of the Assyrian Empire. Essentially wiped the Israelite peoples off the map. He did not do the same to Judah, but his successor, Sennacherib, in the year 701 BC, forced Judah into submission, taking Manasseh's father, Hezekiah, and as it is put, I think, in one of the Assyrian annals that survives, shutting him up like a bird in a cage in Jerusalem during a siege, forced him to submit to the Assyrian power and to pay tribute. And after that time, Judah existed as a vassal kingdom. So when Manasseh, the boy king, came to power in Judah, he came to power as a vassal of the Assyrians, who controlled all the territory that he surrounding the Judahite kingdom. And Judah was just a tiny little part of a great Assyrian empire. There's not much to see. Manasseh is at the very top of this little chart about Nevi'im in the 7th century BCE. You can see that his father was Hezekiah, and his son Amon, and his grandson Josiah. And we know that Jeremiah, his career started in Josiah's reign. So what, you might ask, I think you would be right to ask, does Manasseh have to do with Jeremiah? Well, when you're reading the assigned materials between Jeremiah chapter 1 and Jeremiah chapter 29 for this week, you may encounter this verse, Jeremiah 15, verses 1 to 4. I'll read them out loud. Then Yahweh said to me, though Moses and Samuel stood before me, yet my heart would not turn toward this people. Send them out of my sight, and let them go. And when they say to you, where shall we go? You shall say to them, thus says Yahweh, those destined for pestilence, to pestilence, and those destined for the sword, to the sword, those destined for famine, to famine, and those destined for captivity, to captivity. And I will appoint over them 4 kinds of destroyers, said Yahweh, the sword to kill, the dogs to drag away, and the birds of the air and the wild animals of the earth to devour and destroy. I will make them a horror to all the kingdoms of the earth because of what King Manasseh, son of Hezekiah of Judah, did in Jerusalem. Now, you can dig into the context of Jeremiah 15 and try to figure out exactly when Jeremiah said this. But Jeremiah's entire career spans the years approximately 627 BC to 587 BC. So we know that he is speaking these words, he's bringing this message from Yahweh to the people of Jerusalem sometime in that period. And most of Jeremiah's datable oracles come well after 609 BC in one of the reigns of the last 2 important kings of Judah. And more about that in a lecture that I'll be putting up very shortly. So what is it that King Manasseh, son of Hezekiah of Judah, did in Jerusalem after all? Why is he so bad? Well, his story is told in 2 Kings 20:21 to 21:18. But before we look at that, we have to remember that the author of the Deuteronomic history, the author of 2 Kings, is highly biased against all of the Judahite kings. Looking back from the time of Babylonian exile, the writers, the historians who chose to record the story of the kings of Judah and of Israel, they were seeking to answer one very important question, a question of deep theological importance to all of the Jews who were living in exile in Babylon. And that is, what caused Yahweh to turn aside from his people? What caused Yahweh to permit the pagan empire of the Babylonians to conquer them? Was it the kings? Was it the people themselves? The answer that Deuteronomists consistently find is that the kings of Judah and Israel violated the religious covenant between the people of Israel and Yahweh, and that so Yahweh chose to use Babylon as an instrument of punishment, taking the people into exile. Now you may notice that it is exactly the message that is brought by Jeremiah. So historians of the literature of the people of Israel, the Israelite peoples, they place Jeremiah and the Deuteronomic historian very close together in terms of their perspective. They speak almost as one, suggesting that the historians who put together the story of Judah may indeed have been perhaps even in the school of Jeremiah. That's how close Jeremiah and these Jeremiah's views and the theology of the Deuteronomic historians are. So let's go over to 2 Kings and really quickly read through together what is the story. What is the story, we might like to say, or we might like to ask, of Manasseh? I'm having trouble accessing my controls. Here we go. King Manasseh was 12 years old when he began to reign. He reigned 55 years in Jerusalem. Verse 2 tells us something very standard for the Deuteronomic historians, the same thing that it tells us about almost all of the kings, with the exception perhaps of Hezekiah, Josiah, of all in Judah. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, following the abominable practices of the nations. Now, what's interesting, and what most historians have noted, is that we have good reason to believe, both from Assyrian records and from archaeological studies of trade in this period, that Judah was a relatively prosperous country during Manasseh's reign. Trade was opened, temples were built, and so forth. But the Deuteronomic historian will take a very dim view of every activity. Behind it, you can look at the activities of a king who was making an effort to adapt to the environment of an Assyrian empire, being a vassal kingdom within an Assyrian empire. He rebuilt the high places that his father Hezekiah had destroyed. The high places being places of worship that were tended to by local priests throughout Judahite and Israelite territories. Hezekiah had destroyed them in an effort to centralize worship of Yahweh at Jerusalem. He erected altars for Baal, that's the Canaanite god. He made a sacred pole, that's an Asherah or consort of Baal, as King Ahab of Israel had done, worshipped all the host of heaven, and served them. So the charge here is that Manasseh brought polytheism right into the heart of the Judahite royal household and the city of Jerusalem. He built altars in the house of Yahweh, of which Yahweh had said, "In Jerusalem I will put my name." He built altars for all the host of heaven in the two courts of the house of Yahweh. He made his son pass through fire. Now that's fascinating. We don't know for sure what this means, but it is one of the things that both the Deuteronomic historian and Jeremiah singles out for critique regarding the people of Judah in this last century of its independence. The worship of probably what scholars say is the worship of Yahweh through an offering that was known as the Melech offering, later misunderstood as the worship of a god named Molech. But it was a type of offering that was made in which you actually sacrificed your firstborn son as a means of gaining the favor of Yahweh. He made his son pass through fire. He practiced soothsaying and augury. He dealt with mediums and wizards. You can recall that Saul was guilty of the same thing, even though he did outlaw such practices before he used them. He was against them before he was for them. He did much evil in the sight of Yahweh, provoking him to anger. The carved image of Asherah, and this is the same as the sacred pole that's earlier mentioned, that he had made, he set in the house of which Yahweh said to David and to his son Solomon, "In this house and in Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, I will put my name forever." Now this is the second time you get this reference to the idea of the name of Yahweh being what dwells in the temple. That's one of the sort of anachronisms that suggests that reminds us that this text is written in the exile or after. It's not Yahweh per se who dwells in Jerusalem, but his name that dwells in Jerusalem, his sacred name that, unless you're a professor of Bible, you're not supposed to say out loud. Or a student of Bible. You're all free to say it as well. As long as you don't do it with an impious intent or, make any oaths, swear any sacred oaths, I think you'll be fine. Yahweh had said, I will not cause the feet of Israel to wander any more out of the land that I gave to their ancestors, if only they will be careful to do according to all that I have commanded them, and according to all the law that my servant Moses commanded them. Now that's really interesting. As we'll see when we look at Josiah, and that's the next video, this question of what law was known in this time is acute. But as far as the historians who write later from the exilic period are concerned, the entire law of Moses, what they regarded as the sacred law of Moses, was in operation during Manasseh's time, and all of his religious practices violated it. But they did not listen. Manasseh misled them to do more evil than the nations had done that Yahweh had destroyed before the people of Israel. Now you think about what that says. The accusation here is that the Judahites under Manasseh became more wicked than the Canaanites before them. Yahweh said by his servants the prophets, notice that these prophets are not exactly named here, but Yahweh is speaking to Manasseh and in Manasseh's court against Manasseh through the medium of the prophets. Because King Manasseh of Judah has committed these abominations, has done things more wicked than all that the Amorites did who were before him, and has caused Judah also to sin with his idols. Therefore, thus says Yahweh, the God of Israel, I am bringing upon Jerusalem and Judah such evil that the ears of everyone who hears it will tingle. I will stretch over Jerusalem the measuring line for Samaria. That is, they will be given the same punishment that Samaria received. And of course, we know that Samaria was destroyed by the Assyrians. And the plummet for the house of Ahab. Once again, this is a reference to the fall of the northern kingdom of Israel. I will wipe Jerusalem as one wipes a dish, wiping it and turning it upside down. I will cast off the remnant of my heritage and give them into the hand of their enemies. They shall become a prey and a spoil to all their enemies, because they have done what is evil in my sight, and have provoked me to anger since the day their ancestors came out of Egypt, even to this day. So this is a quote from one of the prophets of Judah in this time period, though that prophet is not named. Or perhaps it's just the Deuteronomic historian supplying what would be the most likely thing that prophets, had they spoken in the time of Manasseh, would have said. The next verse is interesting, and it adds an ethical and not just a religious component to the condemnation of Manasseh, and one that I think we ought to take very seriously in terms of this poisonous memory of Manasseh in the history. 2 Kings 21:16. Moreover, Manasseh shed very much innocent blood, until he had filled Jerusalem from one end to another, besides the sin that he caused Judah to sin, so that they did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh. Now the rest of the acts of Manasseh, all that he did, and the sin that he committed, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Judah? Manasseh slept with his ancestors, and was buried in the garden of his house, in the garden of Uzzah. His son Ammon succeeded him. So you can see that in the memory of the Deuteronomic historians, the story of Manasseh is a story of unmitigated disaster for Judah, one which resulted in a promise being issued through the prophets in Manasseh's time that Judah would be destroyed in the same way that the kingdom of Israel had been destroyed. And then we noticed, you recall I began this little excursion by talking about how Jeremiah 2 linked the coming prophecy of his own prophecy of the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians, to these sins of this king who had reigned 100 years in the past, Manasseh. It's very interesting, if you think about it, that when Judahites were faced with the imminent destruction of their kingdom in the time of Jeremiah, when Babylon was looming at the very gates, and Judah was a vassal to a Babylonian kingdom, a Babylonian king, Nebuchadnezzar, who was, as it turns out, destined to destroy the city of Jerusalem and the temple at Zion. When they were faced with that, they looked back 100 years for the reason why Yahweh's anger was turned against them. So that's fascinating, and it's worth thinking about. Thanks for listening, and I'm going to post this video, and then I'm going to make some more.